Welcome to the PICS Annual Forum. Lovely to see you all here, even if you are all just little dots in the bottom of the Teams meeting. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on all the lands on which we speak, on which we are watching this presentation from today, in particular the elders past, present and emerging. And particularly this week, I'd like to acknowledge Uncle Jack, who was an inspirational First Nations man who really broke down a lot of boundaries. So I'm sure we're all thinking of him today. The Victorian Integrated Cancer Service has commissioned this artwork that's on your screen at the moment to represent our commitment to providing an all-encompassing and welcoming space for all Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal participants. This will support the process of working towards improving cancer outcomes for all Victorians. The artist is Vegas Fitzmaurice, and the artwork is called Hope and Connection, Bunjil over Wurundjeri Land. And I'm sure everyone will agree it is a pretty striking piece of artwork, and we're very lucky to have it on our services. So again, welcome to the PICS Annual Forum. This is I think the third one we've done online, and I'd particularly like to acknowledge all the incredible hard work that Justine, Chris, Georgia and Belle have done in getting this right over the line, including all the other staff in the background at PICS. We intend to present an overview of the work completed in the last year with a focus on data. And the title for today's presentation is Questions, Answers and Anecdotes. And this is really important because it's hard to separate data from anecdotes. One of my old consultants one of my mentors used to talk about him being in his anecdotage, because he always had a story about every case that came up. And I was reminded of that when we were talking yesterday about anecdotes. When I was an intern in my very first week, I saw a patient who was complaining of a stiff back after an anaesthetic. And I looked at him and sure enough, his shoulders were on the bed and his hips were on the bed, but his back was completely arched over. And I had no idea what was going on, and called my consultant and he said, it's an ocular gyric crisis from Maxilon. I thought, yes, that's a recognised complication of this drug. That's very important. So for the next few years, whenever I saw a patient with a stiff back, I'd look knowingly at my consultant and say, I think it's an ocular gyric crisis. And he'd go, no. And in the 31 years since that day, I have never seen another ocular gyric crisis. So it just is a measure that we need to be very careful of, how much we take our individual experiences and how that can trump us emotionally over hard-won data. But it is also important to look at data objectively and look at data as the whole package, because as we all know, there are lies, damn lies and statistics. So for instance, is an increased reporting of domestic violence because there's more domestic violence, or because more victims of domestic violence are enabled to stand up and talk about it? So I can rabbit on about that all day, but I'll let the cleverer people talk now. So I think Justine's next.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Greg. Yes, and thank you all for joining us today in Childhood Cancer Awareness Month to reflect on the past year. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Justine Carter. I'm the Programme Manager for PICS, and I will be talking about the achievements of PICS over the last year. All of you don't need me to tell you that the last 12 months have been an incredibly challenging environment for frontline staff providing healthcare to patients and families. It's also been a challenging environment to collaboratively deliver service improvements when teams are stretched to deliver normal care and there's really limited time to focus on new things. With that in mind, I'm so very proud of the achievements of the PICS team working in partnership with many people here today in these challenging circumstances. I'm particularly proud of the supportive team culture that has managed to grow and develop despite spending the majority of this year apart. And we are looking forward to spending a little more time together and on site with clinical teams and consumers moving forwards. So I want to tell you all about the core achievements of PICS in the last year, where we've been developing how we do things and setting the stage for future work. We have completed frameworks to guide how we work with both consumers and data. We've completed service reviews of the survivorship and regional programmes, evaluations of existing services and scoping projects to establish recommendations for future improvements. We continue to work to develop agreed quality monitoring measures to help guide services in adhering to the paediatric oncology care pathways. And in partnership with On Track at PICS, we have led the development of an adolescent and young adult optimal care pathway. We've supported implementation projects to improve patient and staff experience. And finally, in the technology space, PICS is supporting the development of a digital navigator app for patients and families to access at the end of treatment. And we're also leading the development of a childhood cancer survivorship registry. This is our year at a glance. This timeline forms part of the PICS annual report, which will be published shortly, and we will circulate that to everyone who has been involved with us over the last year. So we started off the year with a focus on consumer engagement. In July, we took the opportunity between lockdowns to come together to commence the development of our consumer engagement framework, with a staff workshop focusing on co-design, or actually co-creation is the term that we landed upon. This work kick-started the establishment of a consumer working group, which included parents and former patients who, with guidance from PICS, actually wrote our consumer engagement framework for us, which we launched in January. The core elements of this framework were then embedded into the PICS project planning documentation, and I'm very pleased to say that almost every single project that PICS has completed in the last year has had significant and meaningful involvement from consumers throughout the design and execution phases. I extend my sincere thanks to all of the members of that consumer working group and any parents or young people who've participated in our projects this year. In the last year, PICS became a member of the Victorian Paediatric Cancer Consortium, an entity made up of some of Victoria's leading research, academic, clinical organisations, all focused on children's cancer research. And in August, the VPCC was awarded a significant grant through the Medicines Research Futures Fund, with a proportion of those funds directed towards PICS to develop a childhood cancer survivorship registry. This project will expand on the existing database to develop a full research registry with input from childhood cancer researchers and clinicians. We aim to build long-lasting collaborations with teams across Australia and New Zealand to drive survivorship research. PICS has again expanded the suite of resources we provide to families and clinicians. In September, PICS published 40 chemotherapy fact sheets. These are resources given to families detailing each drug their child is treated with, and have had these translated into 4 additional languages: Vietnamese, Simplified Chinese, Dari, and Arabic. These resources are some of our most accessed documents on our website, and we will continue to add to the suite at the request of the clinical team. As I mentioned before, in February, in partnership with On Track at PICS, PICS led the development of an optimal care pathway for adolescents and young adults. I'm pleased to say that this document has received endorsement from Cancer Australia and is currently working through the national endorsement process with all state and territory health departments. Going through this process has helped us to understand how we can take the paediatric oncology care pathways to that next level and work towards national consensus for optimal care for children's cancer. In the last year, PICS has reviewed the clinical services that we deliver. In October, we completed the long-term follow-up programme service review, generating 37 recommendations for improvement. To date, we have completed 10, with another 10 in progress. Some of the yet to be completed recommendations are linked to other service developments like the Digital Navigator project and the Survivorship Registry project. In April, we completed the Regional Outreach Shared Care Programme service review, generating 13 recommendations, and we'll hear more about these from Chris Williams later in today's session. The regional programme will be a significant focus for PICS over the next 12 months. In March, we completed an evaluation of the pre and post chemotherapy home-based hydration programme at the Royal Children's, which was originally implemented following the PICS osteosarcoma project. The evaluation identified many positive benefits of the programme, including high family satisfaction and opportunities to expand the programme to benefit more families. These changes are being worked on currently. The model of care was presented at ANZCHOG this year, prompting significant interest from children's cancer services across Australia and New Zealand. In the patient experience space, in December, we completed a scoping project designed to understand the challenges families face with administering medications at home. The recommendations focused on the development of resources for families and improvement in the written and verbal communication of medications to families. This project was presented as a poster at ANZCHOG this year, and we will focus on the implementation of those recommendations over the coming months. In the implementation space, through June and July, PICS staff worked in partnership with leaders at Monash Children's to redesign the day oncology scheduling system. Working as a fast-paced project, issues and solutions were quickly worked through to support an August go live. The changes have received positive feedback from staff and families alike. And finally, in June this year, the PICS Data and Information Management Framework was published, which will underpin the next evolution of data analysis PICS will be able to provide to health services. This project was led by PICS Deputy Manager Belinda Zambello, and I will now hand over to Belle to tell you more about the framework and how PICS will be focusing on data moving forwards. Over to you, Belle.
Thank you, Justine. So there are 9 integrated cancer services in Victoria, including PICS, who have access to a wide range of local and statewide patient-level data. In 2020, a project was proposed to develop the first statewide PICS data and information management framework to drive the improvement and standardisation in the way the VICs acquire, access, store, manage, share, and use data. This project was based on the following agreed principles: alignment of PICS strategic and data priorities, embedding two-way influence processes, managing the people, risks and costs, processes, policies and culture around ICS-held data, working collaboratively to leverage and manage data for better patient outcomes and VICS-wide strategic advantage, coordinating, integrating and managing our data sources, and continuous data quality improvement. Across the 9 ICS in Victoria, each has its own version of a cancer data service, with analysts supporting their partner health services with strategic planning, service planning and redesign, quality and performance monitoring, and service improvement projects. But there are differences in what these data services and supports looked like, and a lot of duplicated effort. Essentially, with limited resources, a jack-of-all-trades approach was required, and with several different information systems in place, sharing resources was difficult. I was fortunate to be supported by a strong project governance structure who agreed that if this was to have the intended impact at the state level, we would need to involve staff and key stakeholders representative of all roles and of all ICS. We constructed 5 working groups through a formal EOI process and had 12 months to develop the framework. Each of the working groups contributed to the development of one of the 4 key documents of the framework and any required supporting resources. The working groups met through weekly huddles, formal monthly meetings, and community of practice events. And together we produce a detailed and robust framework with a clear data vision. Data is everybody's business. We must build a culture where we collect, access, view, analyse and use patient and health-related data and information with the mindset that every patient matters. And we must respect that every piece of data and information we hold relates to their experience and their life. With the framework published, we consider it the end of the beginning, but with a clear direction and support from our new VICS Data Governance Advisory Group. We can now begin to address each of our data strategy initiatives in a methodical way. We chose the theme of our forum today, questions, answers and anecdotes, as Greg mentioned, to reflect on how the VICS data vision relates to our day-to-day work as Victoria's Paediatric Cancer Service Improvement Network, and how implementation of the framework will support us to be more data and patient focused. I've always been wary of the term anecdotal evidence. An anecdote is a personal account, potentially a theory to investigate, but it's not evidence. Working with anecdotes can be a good starting point, but it can also cause complacency, and without monitoring, opportunities can be missed. So I'm going to take you through a few of my own personal stories to demonstrate the power and importance of a data-driven culture in healthcare. I started my career as a manager of health information services working in community and mental health nearly 20 years ago. Before I accepted the position, I was warned of a tough, unforgiving culture, that mental health staff were hardened by their work, tell it how it is types, and it would be difficult to drive change, particularly because of my age and inexperience. Soon after I started, I had the opportunity to join the leadership team in representing our health service in Canberra at the Health Roundtable meetings. These meetings intended to encourage transparent conversations between mental health services across Australia about health service performance. Guards were lowered and lessons were generously shared. It was a deep dive into sensitive detail, guided by a suite of agreed key performance indicators. It was far from the culture I'd been warned of. The senior mental health staff were passionate about best practice care, data-driven care, and it showed in their willingness to collaborate and share their data, and their dedication to improving data and information management systems locally. Although the Health Roundtable meetings were designed with health services de-identified, those in the room quickly agreed that it would be more effective to be transparent. Perhaps this was one of the benefits of that tell it how it is culture. Of course, there were awkward prefaces, and in some ways it felt a little like sharing your bank statements would. It takes a bit of bravery and certainly requires trust. We were fully exposed, but it did drive change. When you are benchmarking on elements of healthcare and outcomes that are as serious as those dealt with in a secure mental health ward, the data cannot easily be dismissed. Once moving on from mental health and working across specialty areas such as aged and community care, chronic disease management, disability, and of course cancer care, I came to realise that the unguarded culture I witnessed and became a part of is not the norm in healthcare. Competition certainly appears to be a common enemy of collaboration, and as I was recently reminded by my project chair, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But I don't think that's all there is to it. I have had countless conversations with clinical and executive teams about data accuracy. Occasionally, those conversations don't go very far. Sometimes it's just been a statement, the numbers are wrong. But the conversations that lead to change are those that consider the why and the what we can do about it. I've wondered what can other specialties learn from the mental health units who face very similar political, governance, funding, workforce, and clinical challenges. Interestingly, I think one of the big factors that drove the culture was the availability of accurate, consistent, and complete data. Victoria had and still has a statewide mental health patient registry, the CMI ODS. The CMI ODS still serves the purpose for which it was created. It is a critical source of business intelligence for the mental health sector, and the data collection, even back in 2004, was embedded in their day-to-day workflow. 18 mental health units in public hospitals across Victoria contribute to this system, and business decisions are made on its content. These objectives are so familiar, and in the context of cancer care and cancer survivorship, we too want to be able to accurately identify consumers across the cancer care system in order to support safety, person-centred integrated care, and to share relevant information. There is so much enthusiasm for accurate cancer data to monitor quality of care, facilitate service improvement, and support research. And with the EMR HO database operating across the Royal Children's and Monash Children's Hospitals, we have tried and have been successful in the past. But as a network, what are our barriers now? And how can we work collaboratively to improve our current position? We, like mental health, need to invest in improving what we collect and how, but we must acknowledge that we all have a role. Data is everyone's business, and accuracy stems from consistent practices at the source. The second of my stories is a more recent story and is an example of how anecdotes and assumptions can lead us astray. Around 10 years ago, I was consulting with several groups of public health service executives in an adult cancer care, looking at their service capacity, demand, and service models around cancer surgery. At several of these health services, we used the data insights developed over many months of consultation to inform their strategic plan so they could build their workforce in a targeted way. They understood their strengths and their weaknesses throughout this work. A few years later, at a joint meeting, my team presented a de-identified analysis piece looking at surgical volume, median post-surgery length of stay, and readmissions within 28 days of discharge. Several people in the room joked that de-identifying the health services was pointless because they knew which health service had the best results. Let's call them Health Service A. I was the only one in the room, having produced the analysis, that knew that they were wrong. As I reflected on the meeting, I realised that they were basing this conclusion on the anecdote that this particular health service did the majority of that particular surgery, which once upon a time had been true, but things had changed. One of the health services who had been working with us to understand their service through data had become more self-sufficient and had been performing the largest volume of that particular surgery for years. But simultaneously, they were innovative in their service redesign, which meant that patients were discharged home safely with a length of stay half of the median. We will call them Health Service B. Once we realised that the anecdote had become a barrier for Health Service A, my team and I decided to take the analysis piece further into further detail and represent it to the two health services as a potential identified benchmarking opportunity. I knew that this could work well, as I'd learnt through my days working in mental health, but I also knew that the culture may prevent this from happening. It was not an easy conversation. It took a lot of work and many deep dives looking at the possible explanations. But it came to a point that Health Service A agreed and were convinced that the data was right. We facilitated a workshop between Health Services A and B so they could compare their services in an unguarded, collegial way. This is a good example of how having visibility of what is going on outside the safety of your own hospital walls through data is so important. "I'm not a data person" is an incredibly common phrase used in healthcare, but that thinking really holds us back. So what is data? Why is it so foreign and intimidating to so many? One of the many data concepts explained in the PICS Data and Information Management Framework to address this is that it needs to be viewed as a building block towards wisdom. Data alone tells us very little. Data, it's just raw facts. They don't have a story. The number 2 floating around on its own could be anything from a cancer stage to the number of siblings a child has. When we add context to data and organise it, we create information. 17 becomes 17 years of age or 17 days in hospital. When we analyse that data en masse, we create knowledge. Knowledge is gained from investigating the data in depth, asking more questions about each combination of data points than a child could ask in a day. I can relate to this. But it is the story behind that knowledge that is most powerful. To me, the stories behind the numbers are the gold nuggets. When we see a huge drop in service activity or cancer diagnoses are down, we don't assume that that is a true drop. We ask where the numbers have gone. Has COVID-19 taken patients from metropolitan areas to regional? Are there data entry or submission delays? Has a treatment protocol changed? Has a service model changed? This seems like a simple concept, but one of the biggest challenges as a health informatician is convincing others to dive in and find out why. When we can work together to improve our data, improve the way we organise our information, and improve the way we build and share knowledge, we begin to build wisdom. Actionable data insights can only be developed with the combination of the data, the context, and the knowledge built through thorough investigation. There are few quick wins here, but when we invest in building data capability, capacity, and improving access, the real value and power of data can be realised. And if we can centre our approach around the idea that every piece of data and information we hold relates to a child or adolescent and their family who trust us to use and share their information effectively, that wisdom will more likely lead to initiatives that are in line with community expectations to improve the overall experience of cancer care and patient outcomes. Thank you. I'll hand over now to Chris Williams, who will present on a recent data-driven review of the PICS Regional Outreach and Shared Care Program.
Thanks for that, Belle. So my name's Chris. I work in the Regional Outreach Shared Care Program as a nurse consultant in that role. And so I thought we'd use this opportunity to bring a bit of that data into the clinical setting and seeing how we've utilised that in-service improvement in our regional program. So I just want to have a very brief overview of the PICS Regional Outreach Shared Care Program, present some data around the utilisation and what recommendations we've made, and provide some examples of how we're using data for future planning in our regional program. So here in Victoria, we have two major tertiary referral centres for paediatric and adolescent cancer care that do the diagnostics and the prospective treatment plan. That's the Monash Children's Hospital and the Royal Children's Hospital's Children's Cancer Centres. And we have 9 health service partners in regional Victoria that we work with as part of the shared care program. And they're from Wangaratta, from Geelong, Bendigo Health, Ballarat, Latrobe in Traralgon, Frankston with Peninsula Health, Warrnambool Southwest Healthcare, Albury-Wodonga Health, and Shepparton in Goulburn Valley Health. And the role of the PICS is around facilitating that shared care close to home as often as we can. And so we're not directing that care, but we're the bridge between them to make sure that that care is planned and any prospective plans are available to the local families close to home. So each regional service itself has an identified medical lead, we have nursing leads, and we have a formal service agreement between all the health services, Monash, RCH and the regional health service, to talk about what we're going to do in that area. And that's underwritten by a service capability framework that actually defines what that scope of practice actually will be. So in the regional program, there's 2 levels according to the service capability, and that framework covers all cancer care here in Victoria. But for Traralgon, North East Health in Wangaratta and Peninsula, it's really around shared care services that provide supportive care. And then for those other services, we've actually expanded that to actually have a low complexity chemotherapy service. And we've been quite purposive in choosing those chemo agents to actually know are going to be repeated often and to reduce the burden of travel for families. And so Albury, Ballarat very recently, Barwon, Bendigo, Goulburn Valley and Shep and Southwest Healthcare have been doing that service for chemotherapy as well. So Belle talked to us about anecdotes, and if you were to ask me anecdotally and assumptions around what we do here in Victoria, I'd probably guess there's about 250 new diagnoses each year under the age of 18. I'd probably say about 1/3 of those patients live in regional Victoria. Probably 1/3 of the patients we see would have some type of acute leukemia, maybe 1/5 have a tumour of the CNS, 1/2 probably have some type of solid tumour, and I'd probably guess or assume that about 1/3 of that supportive care could happen or should happen locally. But can we plan effective care service with this type of methodology and just making our assumptions on what we've known in the past? This was a quote that comes up quite a lot, and the plural of anecdote is not data. And as Belle mentioned, anecdotes are based on personal observation, but we need to plan a service based on systematically captured actuals. We need to not only define what the quality of care is, but we need to know the wheres and the whens of it's happening. Is it supported? Is it appropriate? And is that care safe? So we put together a regional data set, and Nicole Siriani, who works with me, has done this work, and she's populated quite a large data set now of our regional patients. And that was initially there to support care coordination, but it's really now about collating data and looking at what we can do with that data. And so to date, having a look at that yesterday morning, there were 429 patients within the cancer services from regional Victoria who are currently on treatment or in active surveillance. What's interesting to note when you drill down in that data is 100 of those 429 don't actually live near one of our 9 regional shared care services. We know that 22 of those families actually live in Tassie and are here actually for high complexity care. And another interesting note is that we now have 13 patients that actually reside in Mildura, where we don't have quite a remote area where we don't have any shared care service that's formal. So what that makes us think about that data, we need to investigate those other 100 families. Are there trends? I know there's some colleagues from Women's and Children's in South Australia now on here today that actually also share patients in Mildura. Is there something there we need to consider? And this data set is helping us think about that instead of just thinking about that anecdotally. This graph here shows us the treatment status by regional catchment, and these are patients that are in active surveillance according to their regional area. The next lighter blue there talks about those that are currently on treatment in those areas. There are 2 small cohorts of patients that are either under palliative care service or have recently undergone a bone marrow transplant. And then there's a significant degree of patients in those areas that we see that actually are in the long-term follow-up or survivorship program. The data here shows us that, Barwon is certainly in Geelong, is certainly an area where we have a lot of patients and we need to think about expanding our services there. And many of the others are based on population, but one that's surprising, one that came to us really was the Gippsland. And although it's based centrally in Traralgon, there's a large cohort of patients that are travelling either to Monash or to Royal Children's for their care. And it got us thinking about how can we expand and service and support people in that region. This comes from VAED data, and it talks about local emergency admissions, and it goes over the last 3 years and those unplanned admissions to hospital. And you can see here that there's certainly activity in some, but it's missing in others. And we know the practice is happening and that activity is happening in those areas. And what shows us here is that this current data set has not given us the complete picture and needs refining. And I think this, although this data is incomplete, I think these are gifts to give us to say, how can we make this really work properly? And how can we go about with work Belle's done around ensuring that the local emergency missions are captured? And I think it's important because unplanned care is associated with the greatest clinical risk. These are the patients that may have needs for supportive care, fever, neutropenia, etc. And this slide shows us regional clinic attendance. Now, 20 to 2021 was a bad year for COVID, of course, but it shows us those clinics that we did and the numbers of patients we saw. Overwhelmingly, you can see here that the large cohort comes from Geelong and Albury. Albury, we see 4 clinics a year, and in Barwon, we actually have 6 clinics a year. What it shows us, though, is that the numbers are small in the other areas, and though the numbers I presented earlier show that there are a lot of children in that area that are travelling down still for their either survivorship, surveillance, or even treatment reviews. And so we need to think about increasing the capacity in the others. What it shows us here as well, though, in the light blue, is that in Albury, we had 30 patients that were in the survivorship program we saw in that year, and we could almost consider expanding to having a dedicated survivorship clinic in that region. And this final graph shows us chemotherapy episodes, and it gives us a breakdown of the amount of chemo encounters we're doing in regional services for patients according to their area that they live in. And one of those areas you can see that consistently Geelong has had quite a lot of chemotherapy. And again, this is about giving us thought around expanding that service in Barwon Health. As Justine mentioned earlier, this year we did some consumer engagement, and some of the feedback we got from that was that home location was generally or always taken into consideration when we were planning care, and that's quite comforting to know. The program, though, was usually raised after finished treatment rather than at the beginning, and that's something for us to think about as well. Communication of care within and between care teams rated highly, including during their transition. And there were good experiences with local emergency presentations and unplanned admissions. There was high confidence in the regional centre for those that had local chemotherapy, and that's great for us to know when we're expanding practice, that as we increase that scope of practice, that the families feel confident in their local services. When we talked about the experience of their quality of life, their families would say they were less disruptive to everyday life. Having therapy back home meant kids go to school. For those of us that do regional clinics, we know a lot of kids come in their school uniform first thing in the morning. They're usually not happy because they have to go to school and don't get a day off to go to Melbourne. But for the family and for the long-term needs of that patient, that's really important they can do that. There was the idea of reduced travel expenses was fantastic. The family could stay together as a family, and there was obviously a lot more stress. But what can we learn from that? Well, when we look at that data, it was a smaller sample size than we'd want for 9 regional services that were supporting over 400 patients. So one of the recommendations for that is for us to bring that to scale and really get true generalizable data from all those regional centres to see where we're going well and where we can improve. And some suggestions we had from improvement from that data set was that we need better connection to local services that can offer support. And that went beyond just standard oncology care, but more other local charity services. And I know some of our charities are on today are looking into that as well, as how can we support those families locally. And another highlight that came out was being better at communicating when we transition to adult service. And living in regional Victoria is going to be very hard to find the appropriate services when we move in patients into the adult world. And so these are suggestions we'll take on board as well when we're evaluating our services. And so how are we acting on that data? Well, as I said, a large cohort of patients we know are from that Gippsland region. It covers a lot of land with one small service, not quite in the middle of it. So what we've done is PICS have now funded a nurse coordinator role that has now been advertised, and it will be based at Monash Children's Hospital. Primarily, most of this work comes out of Monash Children's. So that role is being funded to drive that engagement and collaboration. And what we really see in this is this large geographical distance is there's a key role for that person to support surveillance and in particular survivorship care for families that may be travelling. And this is really going to benefit those regional shared care services down the Mornington Peninsula and particularly the wider Gippsland region. And how we're using our data to plan. So I've described the large activity in chemotherapy, in clinics and in patient numbers in the Barwon Health catchment. We're hoping to support Geelong, and we've got planned meetings to have with them in considering the expansion of oncology services as the new Barwon Women's and Children's Hospital build comes on board over the next couple of years. And we feel this is an ideal time for us to consider expanding that service for outpatient care for local families. And so from a data perspective, PICS will provide predictive analytics, activity mapping and forecasting to the Barwon team to help them define and look at a business case for what we could do locally. And program evaluation, as Justine said, as a focus for next year in the regional program is really around capturing the experiences of the services of the regional service providers, looking at the impact evaluation through patient reported experience measures, the evaluation of clinical education, which I believe is critical, and we need to look at how we're doing that and how we're delivering that, and is that well? And it's important to also examine the stories behind the data. And sometimes we get an understanding of the data, but what is it that defines that? And so sometimes it's beyond the numbers. And as Belle talked about that it's more than just data and analytical numbers. And sometimes there's a story behind it we need to look at. But there is always challenges with data and planning. And we know that in the cancer space, the children with cancer are very rare and diverse group, which makes reporting very hard when we're talking with small numbers. And small numbers means that each patient experience may not actually reflect the next. Individual patient factors will often impact on shared care potential rather than just certain diagnoses. And we know that that means long-term data is critical to help us identify trends and long-term trends and help us planning significant changes that will benefit families in the long term. And even though we have long-term data, we have a philosophy in our PICS shared care program, as do our service providers regionally, to be very responsive to the local community, to the needs and the immediate demands of those patients we have, those few patients, and to still personalize care whenever we can. So in summary, data support informed decision-making in the Regional Outreach Shared Care Program and will continue to do so. The examination of data shows us that we have still a lot of work to do it well, and we're looking forward to doing that with what's been built currently by PICS. Anecdotal considerations need to be made with caution, and I think Belle pointed that out very well in her presentation. And it's not just quantitative data, but it's really important we collect that qualitative data to yield important information about the patient experience. Does traveling a long way actually improve the experience for families? It's important to acknowledge the diversity and the rarity and the impact childhood cancer has, and that'll still demand consideration as we move forward in collecting that data. And regardless, PICS will continue to encourage recommendations within our regional outreach program that are informed by data whenever we can and whenever that is possible. Thank you very much for the talk, and I'll hand this back.
Thanks, Chris. That was terrific. I'd like to congratulate all three of our speakers today, showing the breadth of work that PICS does. And as the medical director of PICS, I get to bask in the reflected glory of all the hard work that's been done. And I think particularly Justine and Belle through COVID have done a remarkable job keeping the output of fantastic work despite horrendous challenges. So I'd like to thank you all. I don't think we were planning questions, but if anyone's got any burning questions, put it up in the chat. But otherwise, I'll hand over to Justine to do the final bits.
That's fine, Greg. I've just checked the chat and that there are no questions. So with that, we will release everyone with 15 minutes to spare for their day. Thank you all for coming today. And if there are any projects or things we've spoken about today that have piqued your interest, please do get in touch. We're always looking for collaborators. So have a good day and thank you.